At 40 years old, Christina Allen went to see the abandoned windmill she had inherited, and nothing she found there was what she had expected. But before she ever reached that overgrown hill wrapped in silence, she had to survive the worst month of her life. Everything collapsed on an ordinary Tuesday. Marcus, the man she had shared 12 years with. A rented house, shared bills, and the quiet illusion of a future, packed his bags while she was still at work. He left no note. He left half the month's bills unpaid and a dirty coffee mug in the sink, as though that small and careless detail said everything he believed she deserved. Christina found out from the neighbor, who saw her coming up the walk with grocery bags and looked away before saying, in a low and uncomfortable voice, that Marcus's car had left too early that morning with too much luggage to be anything but permanent. She walked inside and stood in the middle of the living room for a long time. She didn't cry right then. The crying came later, in the shower, where no one had to see. Christina worked as an administrative assistant at a small veterinary clinic, an honest job that covered the bills without leaving much behind. Marcus had contributed to the rent and to the feeling that someone was on the other side of things. Without him, the numbers didn't add up. She ran the calculations 3 times, as though redoing them might change the result. They didn't. In less than 60 days, she wouldn't be able to cover the rent on her own. It was in that state, hollowed out and exhausted, that the call from the law office came. A formal voice, slightly hurried, informed her that Augusta Allen had passed away 2 years prior and that the estate proceedings had finally been completed. Christina was the sole heir named in the will for a specific asset, an old windmill on a rural property several hours away, registered in the family name for over 80 years. Christina was quiet for a moment. She barely knew Augusta. Her great-aunt had been a distant, almost mythical figure in family stories, a woman who had chosen to live alone on a rural property at a time when that was considered far too eccentric for a woman of her generation. They had met only a handful of times, always at family gatherings where Augusta arrived late, spoke little, and observed everything with eyes that seemed to record more than anyone realized. Christina remembered sitting beside her at one of those occasions when she must have been in her mid-20s. Augusta had held her hand briefly, without saying anything, and smiled in a way Christina had never quite known how to interpret. And now that quiet woman had left something for her. The news reached Clifton Hale before Christina had time to think clearly about any of it. Clifton was a second cousin, the kind of relative who only appeared when there was something to be gained. He called that same evening, using that easy, agreeable voice Christina had always found slightly false, like varnish over rotting wood. "Christina, isn't this something?" he said, as though commenting on the weather. "Listen, I know that property. I drove out there once, years ago. The place is in terrible shape. Old windmill, no use, no infrastructure. There are probably years of back taxes owed on it, maybe water damage, possibly structural issues. I have a contact who could take it off your hands right now before it becomes a real problem. A fair price, given the condition." Christina asked what fair meant. Clifton named a number she immediately recognized as far too low, even without knowing anything about rural real estate. There was too much urgency in his voice, too much warmth. "I'll think about it," she said. "Don't wait too long," he replied. "Abandoned property accumulates problems. The longer you wait, the worse it gets." She hung up and looked at the dirty mug Marcus had left in the sink. She still hadn't washed it. She didn't know why. 3 days later, Christina packed a change of clothes into a backpack, told the clinic she needed a few days off, and got in the car. She couldn't have explained clearly what was pulling her. It wasn't hope, exactly. It was something closer to the need to see for herself before signing anything, before giving up one more thing. The property sat on top of a low hill, reached by a dirt road her GPS refused to acknowledge. Christina navigated the last few miles by instinct, following handwritten directions the attorney had tucked in with the documents, as though he had known technology wouldn't reach that far. When the windmill appeared on the horizon, she stopped the car and looked through the windshield for a long moment. It was larger than she had imagined, and older. The stones at the base were darkened by moisture and time, plaster had fallen from the walls in wide patches, and the wooden sails, or what remained of them, hung at angles that suggested decades of neglect. The main door was secured with a rusted padlock. Around the structure, wild grass and brush had grown without restraint, but something in the way the stones fit together, in the proportion of the narrow windows, in the undeniable solidity of those century-old walls, kept Christina from calling it a ruin. She got out of the car with her backpack over one shoulder and the key the attorney had sent in a labeled plastic sleeve. The air smelled of damp earth and something she couldn't immediately name. Something faintly sweet, like old grain or sun-warmed wood. The padlock opened with resistance, as though protesting the interruption. The door groaned. Christina stepped inside. The interior was dim and smelled of mildew and stopped time. Light entered through the narrow window gaps in diagonal bands that lit up floating dust in the air. At the center, the mill's internal mechanisms were still partially intact, layered in rust and cobwebs. A worn table leaned against one wall. 2 wooden stools were stacked in a corner. On a high shelf, 3 empty glass jars stood in a line with a precision that felt deliberately out of place amid the general disorder. Christina moved slowly, running her hand along the stone walls. They were cold and slightly rough, the kind of surface that holds the memory of weather. She made her way around the perimeter of the ground floor, taking in the dimensions, the ceiling height, the placement of the windows. And then she stopped. Something felt wrong about the far wall. She couldn't have said exactly what triggered the feeling, whether it was the way the light didn't reach that corner, the same way it reached the others, or something about the texture of the stone, or simply the instinct of someone who had spent enough time in old buildings to know when a space didn't add up. She stood there for a moment, staring at that wall, before pulling out her phone and turning on the flashlight. The stones looked the same as the rest, but the mortar between them was slightly different, a shade too uniform, too clean for a wall that old. She pressed her palm flat against the surface. It felt solid, but it sounded, ever so faintly, like it wasn't. Christina took a step back and looked at the full dimensions of the room again, mentally measuring what she could see against what the exterior had suggested. The numbers didn't match. The inside was smaller than it should have been. She was still standing there, flashlight aimed at that far wall, when she heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Christina spun toward the door, heart jumping, and found a man standing just outside the threshold with both hands raised slightly, the way people do when they want to make clear they mean no harm. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to startle you. I saw the car on the road and figured someone had finally come out to look at the place." He was somewhere in his early 40s, with the kind of weathered look that came from working outdoors rather than from age. Tanned forearms, worn boots, a canvas jacket with a small tear at the collar that hadn't been mended yet. He held a toolbox at his side like it was a natural extension of his arm. "Jasper Tunney," he said, stepping just inside the doorway. "I've been keeping an eye on the property since Mrs. Augusta passed. Doing what I could, anyway. She asked me to, before she got too sick to ask much of anything." Christina studied him for a moment. "She asked you personally?" Yes, ma'am. Known this place since I was a boy. My father did some work for her years ago, and I just kept coming back. He glanced around the interior with the easy familiarity of someone reading a room he'd memorized long ago. You must be Christina. She blinked. She mentioned me? Jasper looked at her steadily. More than once. Christina didn't know what to do with that, so she didn't do anything with it yet. She introduced herself properly, and they shook hands, and she asked him to tell her honestly what kind of shape the building was in. He set his toolbox down and did exactly that, walking her through the ground floor with a directness she appreciated, pointing out where the roof needed immediate attention, which sections of wall had taken on water, where the flooring had weakened. He didn't soften anything, but he didn't dramatize either. He spoke about the windmill the way someone speaks about a sick person they still believe in. It's not as bad as it looks, he said when they had completed the full circle. The bones are solid. You'd be surprised what good bones can carry. That night, Christina slept in her car. She hadn't planned to stay. She had told herself she was coming only to look, to assess, to make an informed decision. But as she sat in the reclined driver's seat, watching the stars appear above the hill with a clarity she hadn't seen since childhood, she ran the numbers again. The property had no mortgage. The back taxes were real, but manageable. The attorney had confirmed a payment plan was possible. Selling to Clifton's contact would clear the debt and leave her with almost nothing. Keeping it meant taking on a project she had no experience with, in a place where she knew no one, with resources that barely qualified as modest. She called her sister that night. Her sister told her to sell. She called her oldest friend, who told her the same thing. Everyone she spoke to agreed that holding on to a broken windmill in the middle of nowhere was not a plan. It was a distraction. It was grief in disguise. Maybe they were right. She had almost convinced herself of that when, just after midnight, she heard a sound near the base of the hill. She sat up in the seat and looked out. In the moonlight, she could make out a figure moving carefully along the tree line. Not approaching, not retreating, just there. She watched until it disappeared, telling herself it was probably an animal, probably nothing. But sleep didn't come easily after that. In the morning, Jasper arrived before 8 with coffee in a thermos, and no particular explanation for the gesture. He handed her a cup through the car window without ceremony and told her the roof section on the north side needed to be secured before the next rain, or they'd lose more interior space to water damage. "I'm not sure I'm staying," Christina said. "I know," he said. "Drink the coffee anyway." She did. It was 2 hours later, while Jasper was up on a ladder assessing the roof, and Christina was clearing debris from the ground floor, that she found the cat. It was pressed into the corner behind the stacked stools, a small, gray tabby, thin in the way that meant it had been fending for itself for some time, with one eye partially crusted shut. It didn't run when she crouched down. It just looked at her with the particular exhaustion of something that had been waiting a long time to be noticed. Christina sat down on the floor beside it. She thought about the drive back. She thought about the empty apartment, the unpaid bills, the sink with the mug she still hadn't washed. She thought about Clifton's voice on the phone. Too warm? Too quick? The cat pressed its forehead against her knee. She stayed. The decision wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't come with certainty or a clear plan. It came the way most real decisions come, quietly, almost sideways, with the feeling that walking away would cost something she couldn't afford to lose. The cat needed her. That was the smallest possible reason to stay, and somehow it was enough. Enough to make the rest feel possible. She named the cat Mill. It seemed right. Over the following 2 weeks, Christina established a rhythm. She slept on an air mattress she bought at a general store 20 minutes down the road, set up in the upper level of the windmill once Jasper had confirmed the floor would hold. She worked during the day, clearing, cleaning, hauling debris, while Jasper handled the structural repairs. He came every morning and left before dark, and the arrangement had a natural order to it that neither of them felt the need to discuss. The town nearby was small, the kind of place where a stranger was noticed without being made to feel unwelcome. When Christina stopped at the general store or the small diner on the main road, people were polite but curious. She kept her answers short and her questions few. She was not ready to explain herself to anyone yet. Clifton called twice during that period. She let both calls go to voicemail. The messages were variations of the same theme. Patience wearing thin beneath a layer of continued pleasantness. The offer, he said, was still on the table, but not indefinitely. She noticed things during those 2 weeks that she hadn't registered on her first day. The floor of the ground level had a section near the far wall where the boards sounded different underfoot. A faint hollow note that didn't match the rest. The shelf with the 3 glass jars had a faint outline on the wall behind it, rectangular and deliberate, that she had assumed was old damage, but looked, on closer inspection, more like the ghost of something that had once been mounted there. And that far wall, the one that had stopped her on the first day, continued to bother her. She measured it twice with a tape measure she borrowed from Jasper's toolbox, comparing interior dimensions to what she could estimate from outside. The wall was too thick, significantly too thick. She mentioned it to Jasper on a Wednesday afternoon while they were eating sandwiches outside on the stone steps. "I noticed that too," he said after a pause. "Years ago. I asked Mrs. Augusta about it once." Christina looked at him. "What did she say?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his water bottle in his hands. "She said some walls are built to wait." Christina looked back at the windmill. The afternoon light hit the stones at a low angle, and for a moment the whole structure looked different. Less like a ruin, and more like something deliberately holding its breath. That night, after Jasper had gone and Mill was curled against her side on the air mattress, Christina lay awake thinking about that phrase, "Some walls are built to wait." It was the kind of thing that could mean nothing. It was also the kind of thing that meant exactly what it said. She thought about Augusta, the late arrivals, the careful silences, the hand held briefly without explanation, a woman who had chosen a broken windmill over the comfort of family, who had watched and waited and said very little, and who had, in the end, looked at a niece she barely knew and decided she was the right person for something. Christina didn't know what that something was yet, but she was beginning to understand that Augusta had known exactly what she was doing. The wall came down on a Thursday morning, though that wasn't how Christina had planned it. She had spent the previous evening making careful notes, measurements, observations, the slight discoloration in the mortar she had photographed with her phone and enlarged on the screen until the difference was undeniable. The mortar on the interior face of the far wall was newer than the rest. Not by years, by decades. Someone had repointed those joints deliberately, sometime in the last 30 or 40 years, using a mix that was slightly too smooth for the original stonework. It was done carefully, done well, done by someone who didn't want it noticed. But Augusta, Christina was beginning to understand, had counted on someone eventually looking closely enough. She showed the photographs to Jasper the next morning without saying much. He looked at them for a long time, then looked at the wall, then back at the photographs. "I can open it," he said, "if that's what you want." "Is it structural?" "No," he said. "It's a partition, built inside the original wall cavity. Whatever's original is still behind it." Christina nodded. open it. It took him the better part of 2 hours, working carefully with a chisel and a small pry bar, removing the interior facing stone by stone rather than breaking through. He worked with the patience of someone who understood that what was inside mattered more than the speed of getting there. Christina stood back and watched, holding Mill against her chest, without realizing she was doing it. When the opening was large enough to pass a flashlight through, Jasper stepped aside. Christina moved forward and aimed the beam into the gap. The space behind the false wall was narrow, no more than 2 feet deep and perhaps 6 feet wide, running along the interior length of that section. It was dry. Whatever Augusta or whoever had built the partition had done it well enough to keep the moisture out for decades. On the floor of the cavity, arranged with a care that felt unmistakably intentional, were 3 things: a flat tin box, roughly the size of a shoebox, sealed with a simple clasp; a smaller wooden box, no bigger than a jewelry case, with a brass latch that had gone green with age; and a single glass jar, identical to the 3 on the shelf above, sealed with a metal lid containing what appeared to be folded paper. Christina reached in and brought out the tin box first. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white and was now the color of old ivory, were documents. She carried them to the table and spread them carefully. Jasper leaned against the wall and said nothing, giving her space to look. The first document was a property deed, the original, handwritten in ink that had faded to brown, dated decades earlier. The windmill and its surrounding land had been purchased by Augusta's father, and the deed listed the full boundaries of the property. Christina scanned the dimensions and stopped. The land was significantly larger than what was listed in the current county records. Not by a small margin, by nearly 40 acres. She read it again, then a third time. "Jasper," she said quietly, "the property is bigger than what's registered." He came to look over her shoulder. He was quiet for a moment. "That matches something my father mentioned once. He said the old boundary markers were moved sometime in the 60s or 70s. He didn't know why." Said Mrs. Augusta's family had never challenged it. Why not? He didn't know that either. Christina set the deed aside and looked through the remaining documents in the tin box. There were receipts, old correspondence between Augusta's father and a county land office, and a hand-drawn map of the original property boundaries with annotations in 2 different handwritings. One set of annotations was in a script she didn't recognize. The other, she realized after a moment, matched the handwriting on the directions the attorney had sent her. Augusta's handwriting. Augusta had been adding to these documents. Recently enough that the ink on her annotations was darker than everything else. Christina's hands were not entirely steady when she set the tin box aside and reached for the glass jar. The paper inside was a single folded page, and it was not old. The date at the top was less than 3 years ago. The handwriting was Augusta's. Careful, slightly labored, the way handwriting looks when the hand that's making it is no longer entirely reliable. Christina, if you are reading this, you found the wall. I knew you would. Not because you are clever, though you are. Because you are the kind of person who looks at a broken thing and wants to understand it, rather than be rid of it. I have watched enough people in this family to know how rare that is. She stopped reading. She wasn't ready for the rest of it yet. She folded the page carefully along its original crease and set it on the table beside the tin box. Later. She would read the rest later, when she could do it properly. She picked up the small wooden box. The brass latch was stiff but gave way without breaking. Inside, on a bed of faded blue velvet, was a key. Old, iron, larger than a modern key, with a simple bow and a long shaft. There was a paper tag attached to it with a piece of twine, and on the tag, in that same slightly labored handwriting, 2 words. Not here. Christina turned the key over in her palm. Not here. She looked around the ground floor of the windmill, at the walls, the floor, the mechanisms, the shelf with its 3 jars. Then she looked at Jasper. "Did Augusta ever mention anything off the property?" she asked. "A storage unit, a safe somewhere. Anything like that?" Jasper thought for a moment. "There's a building," he said slowly. "The old grain store, at the edge of the original property line, about a quarter-mile east, through the tree line. I haven't been inside in years. It's been padlocked as long as I can remember." Christina closed her fingers around the key. They found the grain store where Jasper had described it, half hidden by 20 years of unchecked vegetation. A low stone building with a rusted metal roof, and a door secured by a padlock that, when Christina held the iron key against it, matched in the way that made her breath catch slightly. The key turned. The padlock opened. Inside, the building smelled of dry wood and old dust, and something faintly metallic. There were rusted farm tools hung on the walls, a workbench along one side, and at the far end, built into the corner so naturally it almost looked like part of the wall itself, a standing cabinet made of dark wood, solid and deliberate in a way that nothing else in the room was. The cabinet was unlocked. On the single shelf inside were 2 things, a leather-bound ledger, thick with pages, and a manila envelope sealed with tape that had dried and partially lifted at the corners. On the front of the envelope, in Augusta's handwriting, was written 1 word: Christina. She picked up the envelope and held it. Mill, who had followed them through the tree line and was now winding between her ankles, looked up at her and blinked slowly. "Not yet," Christina said quietly, to the cat, or to herself, or to Augusta. "Not yet." She tucked the envelope under her arm and picked up the ledger with her free hand. They walked back through the tree line as the afternoon light began to drop, the golden angle of it catching the stones of the windmill from a distance and making the whole structure look, for just a moment, like something lit from within. She had barely set the ledger on the table inside when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Clifton. She let it ring. A minute later, a text message appeared. "I heard you've been doing work out there. We need to talk. There are legal questions about that property you should be aware of. Call me." Christina set the phone face down on the table and looked at the manila envelope. Then she looked at the ledger, its pages dense with columns of numbers and dates going back decades. Clifton had heard. Someone had told him something, or he had driven out and seen the car, or some other small thread had pulled his attention back toward the windmill he had been so eager to price and discard. And now there were suddenly legal questions he felt she needed to be aware of. The urgency in the text was different from the urgency in his earlier calls. It was less polished. The varnish, Christina thought, was beginning to show its age. She didn't open the ledger that night. She didn't open the envelope either. She placed both carefully in her backpack and lay down on the air mattress with Mill settled at her feet and the iron key on the floor beside her where she could see it. Some walls are built to wait. She was beginning to understand that Augusta had built more than one. Christina opened the ledger the next morning, before the light was fully up, sitting cross-legged on the air mattress with a flashlight propped against her knee, and Mill asleep beside her. The ledger was Augusta's record of everything. It went back 43 years, written in that same careful hand that had annotated the property documents and addressed the envelope and left a note inside a glass jar behind a false wall in a windmill that everyone else had written off as worthless. The entries were methodical. Dates, names, amounts, descriptions. It took Christina the better part of an hour to understand what she was reading, and when she did, she sat very still for a long time. The 40 acres missing from the current property records had not been lost to administrative error. They had been taken. In the late 1970s, a distant branch of the Hale family, Clifton's grandfather, had filed a boundary adjustment claim with the county land office, supported by a surveyor's report that Augusta's father had contested and lost. The original survey, the one Augusta had kept in the tin box behind the false wall, contradicted the county's adjusted records point by point. The ledger documented every step of that process. Every filing, every objection, every letter sent and ignored. Every year, Augusta had continued to gather evidence, while the land sat in legal ambiguity, and the Hale family quietly assumed control of the disputed acres and eventually sold them to a timber company, for a sum the ledger recorded with the particular precision of someone who wanted the injustice to be legible to whoever came after. The timber rights had long since been exercised. The land itself, however, had never been formally transferred. The original deed still held. Christina was still sitting with the ledger open across her knees when Jasper arrived. She heard his truck on the road and the familiar sound of the door, and then his footsteps on the stone steps, and then he was in the doorway looking at her face and not asking any questions, the way he had learned not to when something important was settling in her expression. She told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat down on the wooden stool across from her and looked at the ledger for a moment before looking back at her. Augusta spent 40 years documenting this, he said. 43, Christina said. He nodded slowly. And she left it to you. She left it to me. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside, a bird called once and went quiet. There's a family gathering this weekend, Jasper said finally. Augusta's generation used to hold them every year at the Fenwick property. Dottie still hosts them. Half the county shows up. Family, neighbors, the people from the land office, the historical society. Clifton will be there. Christina looked at him. I think you should come, he said, with the documents. She picked up the manila envelope from the table. It had been sitting there since the night before, her name on the front in Augusta's handwriting, sealed and waiting. She had been saving it. She knew, the way you know certain things without being able to explain them, that the envelope needed to be opened at the right moment. She thought that moment might be now. She broke the tape carefully and lifted the flap and drew out the pages inside. There were 3 of them, handwritten on the same unlined paper as the note in the jar, but this time the handwriting was steadier, written earlier, when Augusta's hand had still been reliable. Christina unfolded them and began to read. Christina, by the time you read this, you will already know about the wall, and the tin box, and the key, and the grain store. I built that trail for you specifically. Not because you are the only one in the family who could have followed it, but because you are the only one I trusted to follow it for the right reasons. I have watched this family for a very long time. I have watched people choose comfort over honesty, convenience over principle, and money over every other consideration. I do not say this with bitterness. I say it because it is true, and because it matters for what comes next. I watched you too, Christina. I watched you for longer than you know. I was watching at the gathering when you were 23, and you found the elderly Perkins woman sitting alone in the kitchen because no one had thought to include her. And you sat with her for the rest of the evening and listened to her talk about her late husband. I watched when you were 31, and you told the truth about something at considerable cost to yourself, when a lie would have been so much easier, and no one would ever have known the difference. Small things, the kind of things that reveal a person more completely than any large gesture ever could. I am not leaving you this property because of what it is worth. I am leaving it to you because of what you are worth. The windmill, the land, the documents in the tin box. These are tools. What you do with them is yours to decide. But I wanted you to have the means to do something, if you chose to. The Hale family took something that belonged to us. I am not asking you to fight anyone. I am asking you to know the truth, and to let the truth do what truth does when it finally has enough light. I held your hand once and didn't say any of this out loud. I should have. You had kind eyes, Christina, and the kind of patience that is so quiet it gets mistaken for nothing. It is not nothing. It has never been nothing. With love and with confidence, Augusta Christina sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. Mill climbed onto the pages, and she let him. Outside, the morning had opened fully, and the light through the windmill's narrow windows fell in its usual diagonal lines across the stone floor, illuminating the dust and the age and the beauty of the place in equal measure. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Then she folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and looked at Jasper. "Tell me about this gathering," she said. Dottie Fenwick's property was a wide, well-kept farmhouse with a long porch and a barn that had been converted into an event space so gradually that no one could say exactly when it had stopped being a barn. By the time Christina and Jasper arrived on Saturday afternoon, there were cars along both sides of the road and voices carrying from the back of the property and the smell of food on the air. Dottie met them at the gate. She was a small woman in her late 70s, sharp-eyed and unhurried, with the particular ease of someone who has long since stopped worrying about what people think of her. She took one look at Christina and said, "You have Augusta's chin. I always wondered if anyone in that family would." She squeezed Christina's hand and held it for a moment longer than necessary, and Christina thought of Augusta holding her hand at a family gathering decades ago, and understood that some gestures travel further than the people who make them. Clifton found her within 20 minutes. He moved through the gathering with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years cultivating social comfort as a professional tool, and he arrived at Christina's side with a drink in his hand and a smile that was exactly 1 degree too wide. "Christina, I didn't know you were coming." He glanced at Jasper beside her. "Quite a trip from the windmill." "Not that far," she said. "I've been trying to reach you," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "There are some things about the property we really should discuss privately. Some legal complexities that could become complicated if they're not handled correctly." "I appreciate that," Christina said. "Actually, I think this is probably the right place to discuss it. Since so many of the relevant people are here." Something shifted in Clifton's expression. The smile stayed, but something behind it recalibrated quickly. Christina had already spoken to Dottie, who had gathered the relevant people near the long tables at the center of the barn. A county records official who happened to be an old friend of Augusta's, 2 members of the local historical society, 4 other family members who held various stakes in the Hale and Allen family histories, and the attorney who had handled Augusta's estate, who had driven out at Christina's request that morning. She laid the documents on the table: the original deed, the annotated maps, Augusta's ledger, the surveyor's report that contradicted the county's adjusted records. She did not make a speech. She simply placed each item in order and let the attorney and the records official read what was in front of them. Clifton stood at the edge of the group and said nothing at first. Then he said that the documents were old and their provenance was questionable. Then he said that boundary disputes from 50 years ago were not actionable. Then he said that Augusta had clearly been confused in her final years. Each statement came slightly faster than the last, and each one landed differently than he intended in the room, because the room contained people who had known Augusta for decades and who were now looking at a ledger that was methodical and precise, and did not read like the work of a confused woman. The county records official asked Clifton a direct question about his grandfather's original boundary filing. Clifton's answer was long. It did not, when it ended, actually address the question that had been asked. The attorney said, quietly, that in his professional opinion, the original deed remained the controlling document, and that the matter warranted a formal review. Clifton looked around the barn, at the family members, at the neighbors, at Dottie, who was watching him from across the table with the patient, unhurried expression of someone who had always known exactly what kind of man he was. He left shortly after that, without saying goodbye to anyone. The formal review took 4 months. The disputed 40 acres were restored to the property record in Christina's name in the early spring, confirmed by a new survey and an administrative correction that the county processed with a minimum of drama and a maximum of paperwork. The timber rights were long exhausted, and the land itself had largely returned to its natural state. Second-growth forest, wild grass, a creek that ran clear and cold along the eastern boundary. Christina did not sell any of it. The windmill took another year to restore fully. Jasper managed most of the structural work, and Christina did everything else: the interior finishing, the installation of new windows, the painstaking cleaning and preservation of the original mechanisms, which a millwright who drove out from 3 counties away declared to be among the best preserved examples he had seen outside of a museum. The mill would never grind grain again, but it stood, solid and whole and fully itself, on its hill above the reclaimed land. Dottie came for the first coffee Christina made in the restored interior, arriving on a weekday morning with a tin of homemade cookies and no particular agenda. They sat at the table, not the old leaning one which had been replaced, but a new one that Jasper had built from reclaimed wood, and talked for 2 hours about Augusta, about the property, about the long patience it takes to wait for the right person to show up and do the right thing. Mill, fully recovered and considerably rounder than the cat Christina had found behind the stacked stools, slept in a patch of window light throughout. The 3 glass jars still stood on the high shelf. Christina had cleaned them and kept them exactly where Augusta had placed them. She didn't know why Augusta had put them there originally. She suspected it was partly practical, and partly the same quiet humor that had written "not here" on a paper tag, and expected someone to understand. She left them where they were. Jasper stayed too, in the way that some people stay, not all at once, and not with any formal announcement, but gradually, naturally, in the manner of something that had always been true, and was simply taking its time becoming visible. By the summer, his truck was parked beside the windmill more mornings than not, and by the autumn, the question of where he belonged had answered itself so quietly that neither of them felt the need to remark on it. One evening in October, they sat on the stone steps outside the windmill as the light dropped over the reclaimed land, and Jasper handed her a cup of coffee and asked her what Augusta would think of all of it. Christina looked out at the hill, at the tree line where the grain store still stood behind its veil of cleared brush, at the far boundary where the creek caught the last of the light. "I think she would say it took long enough," Christina said. Jasper smiled. "And the windmill." Christina looked up at the restored sails, turning very slightly in the evening wind for the first time in decades, moving with the slow and patient rhythm of something that had been waiting a long time to be set in motion again. "I think she'd say it was always meant to turn," Christina said. She held her coffee with both hands and let the warmth of it travel through her palms and up her arms, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she felt entirely in the right place. If you made it all the way here, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a small thing for you, but it means everything on this end. Leave a comment and let me know what you thought of Christina's story. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.